All right, let's dive into the world of economics. Now, I know what you're thinking. Economics, isn't that all like dry and boring?
Yeah, a lot of people think that.
But trust me, this is going to be anything but boring. You see, you've given us some really cool sources about the history of economic thought, and we're going to uncover how these ideas, some from like centuries ago, still affect our world today.
Exactly.
So we're not just talking about numbers and graphs here.
Right.
We're going to like really dig into how these ideas shape how we see the world and how they affect everything from government policies to like your own everyday choices.
Yeah. So we're diving into a book called The Ideas That Rule Us by Chris Grocott, published just this year in 2025.
2025, so cutting edge stuff.
It really digs deep into how these ideas that are often presented as like just common sense are actually super intertwined with politics and philosophy.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about like pure economics. There's like a whole like philosophical side to it as well.
Exactly. And what Grocott argues is that economics, even though it's often presented as this like purely objective science,
right,
it's actually loaded with values and assumptions that can lead to very different outcomes for different people.
Oh, okay.
For example, he looks at how the concept of the invisible hand.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Which is like a core idea in free market economics.
Right.
Has been used to justify everything from deregulation to massive wealth inequality.
Yeah. The invisible hand, it sounds almost like mystical.
Yeah.
Like some kind of force that's just guiding the economy.
Exactly.
To some perfect balance.
Yeah, and that's like part of the problem, right?
Okay.
Because the idea comes from Adam Smith.
Oh, Adam Smith, yeah.
Often called like the father of modern economics.
OG economist.
Pretty much. And he argued that when individuals pursue their own self-interest in a free market,
right,
it ultimately leads to greater wealth for everyone.
So is he basically saying greed is good?
Well, not exactly. Smith's ideas were actually a reaction to the absolute monarchies of his time.
Okay.
He believed that free trade and competition would empower people against those in power and lead to more economic growth.
Right, so in that historical context, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But how did his ideas get, like, twisted into this whole greed is good mentality we see today?
Yeah. Well, over time, Smith's ideas, they got simplified.
Okay.
And taken to extremes, especially by people who benefited from less regulation and more concentration of wealth. Like, think about when Boris Johnson said that zillionaires deserve as much support as homeless people.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty stark example of how that kind of thinking plays out in the real world.
Yeah, that's wild. It definitely makes you think about, like, does everyone really benefit equally from this whole free market idea?
Yeah.
Because if the market's supposed to be, like, self-regulating, why do we have such huge gaps between the rich and poor?
That's where Grocott brings in Karl Marx.
Oh, Karl Marx, okay.
Whose critique of capitalism is still super relevant today.
Okay. I actually remember this funny anecdote from the book. It's where this union leader, he goes on TV and just completely, like, flusters the host by pointing out all the similarities between Smith and Marx.
Oh, yeah.
It just shows you these ideas, they're not just, like, settled and done with.
Definitely not. And Marx's concept of surplus value gets at the heart of his critique.
Surplus value? Okay.
Yeah. He argued that the profits that capitalists make come from the difference between the value workers create and the wages they actually receive.
Yeah.
So basically, he saw profit as like being extracted from the labor of workers.
So if you're an average person working a job, the surplus value is like the chunk of your hard work that you don't even see in your paycheck.
That's the argument.
Wow.
And when we see these CEOs make hundreds of times more than their employees, it's hard to just dismiss Marx's ideas as irrelevant, right?
Absolutely. This is making me rethink a lot of those like common sense economic ideas I always just took for granted.
That's the power of examining these ideas critically. And it leads us to another important topic. Unemployment.
Unemployment, okay.
Grocott outlines these different types of unemployment. Frictional, structural, classical, and voluntary.
So there are like different types of unemployment. I mean, I get that unemployment is bad, but
it's more nuanced than just people not having jobs.
Okay.
So imagine someone quits their job to find a better one.
Yeah.
That's what we call frictional unemployment.
Yep.
It's like temporary, just a natural part of a dynamic economy. But then think about what happened in like old mining towns,
Wow.
when the entire industry collapsed.
Yeah, those people were just like left behind.
Exactly. That's structural unemployment, where like whole industries disappear, leaving people with skills that are no longer needed.
And with all this stuff about like AI and automation taking over jobs, could we see even more structural unemployment in the future?
That's definitely a valid concern. Or think about what happened during those pandemic lockdowns.
Oh, yeah.
All those empty city centers.
Everyone working from home.
That's another form of structural unemployment, caused by a sudden shift in how and where we work.
So it's not always just about like people being lazy or not wanting to work. Sometimes it's like the whole economy is shifting.
Exactly. And it challenges that simplistic view that unemployment is always a personal failing.
Right.
It's way more complex than that.
This is fascinating.
Right.
But it's also kind of overwhelming. You know, it's like, where do we even begin to address all these complex economic challenges?
Well, that's where another key figure in economic history comes in, John Maynard Keynes.
John Maynard Keynes, okay.
He argued that governments have a really crucial role to play
Okay.
in managing the economy, especially during times of crisis.
Oh, like spending money to stimulate demand during a recession?
Yes.
Even if it means going into debt.
Exactly.
That whole nation's credit card argument, I always felt like that was like an oversimplification.
Yeah, it was a way to discredit Keynesian ideas.
Right.
Keynes understood that sometimes the government needs to step in
Okay.
to prevent a complete economic meltdown,
Yeah.
even if it challenges those traditional ideas about balanced budgets.
It's like that idea of the paradox of thrift, right?
Yes.
Where if everyone tries to save money during a recession,
Yeah,
it actually makes things worse.
exactly. It reduces overall demand.
Yeah.
Keynes argued that government spending could, like, counteract that downward spiral and get the economy moving again.
Okay.
And that's the idea that led to the rise of social democracy after World War II.
Okay.
This period when governments took on a more active role
Right.
in managing the economy and providing, like, social safety nets.
So instead of leaving everything up to that invisible hand,
Yes.
governments actually started taking more responsibility
Exactly.
for the well-being of their citizens.
Yes. And it led to some incredible progress in reducing inequality
Okay.
and it improving living standards for so many people.
But then came the rise of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
It seemed to like swing the pendulum back towards free markets and individual responsibility.
And that's right.
So to really understand this shift,
Yep.
we need to see how these ideas played out in the real world.
Yeah.
Especially in Britain, where figures like Margaret Thatcher had a huge impact
Absolutely.
on the economic landscape.
It's a fascinating story.
Okay, so from Adam Smith to Karl Marx to John Maynard Keynes,
Yeah.
these economic ideas, they're not just theoretical concepts.
No.
They have real-world consequences for all of us.
For sure. And as we dig deeper into this history, you'll see how these ideas continue to shape the world we live in today.
I can't wait to keep going.
Me too.
So we talked about Adam Smith, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, big names, big ideas.
Huge impact.
But how did those ideas actually play out in the real world? I'm really curious about what Grocott says about Margaret Thatcher
Oh, yeah?
and her influence on British economics.
Well, Thatcher's time as prime minister in the 80s,
Okay.
it really marked a big shift towards neoliberal policies in the UK.
Okay.
She really pushed the idea of individual responsibility and free markets,
Free markets. Okay.
leading to privatization of industries, the sale of council housing, weakening of trade unions.
Okay, so what did that actually mean for everyday people? Did those policies actually deliver on those promises?
You know, greater prosperity for everyone.
Yeah.
That's a tough question. And the book, it really dives into
Okay.
the successes and failures of Thatcherism.
Okay.
Some people argue that, yeah, her policies led to greater economic efficiency and growth.
Okay.
But others point to the widening gap between the rich and the poor and the erosion of those social safety nets
Right.
as significant downsides.
I remember reading about the sale of council housing,
Yeah.
which was supposed to create this like property owning democracy, but didn't that kind of backfire for a lot of people?
Yeah. Well, the intention might have been to empower people through homeownership.
Right.
The long-term consequences were mixed, you know. Many of those council homes,
Yeah.
they ended up in the hands of private landlords,
Oh, wow.
which led to rising housing costs
Right.
and made it even harder for people to afford a decent place to live.
So it's like the intention behind a policy, it doesn't always like translate into the intended outcome, especially when you're dealing with like the complexities of the real world.
Yeah. And the same can be said for the privatization of industries.
Oh, okay.
While it did lead to competition in some sectors,
Okay.
it also resulted in fragmented services.
Oh.
And in some cases, even higher prices.
Oh, wow.
Like, think about the Hatfield train crash in 2000,
Oh, right. Yeah.
which was partly blamed on underinvestment in infrastructure after privatization.
It's a pretty stark reminder that economic policies, they're not just abstract ideas. They have like real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
Sometimes devastating effects.
It highlights the need for, like, a balanced approach,
Okay.
one that considers both economic efficiency and social well-being.
So where does Tony Blair's New Labour fit into all of this?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't he try to like find that middle ground
Uh-huh.
between Thatcher's neoliberalism and like traditional social democracy?
Right. He called it the third way.
Third way, okay.
It was an attempt to balance free market principles with social justice.
Okay.
But in practice, many argue that New Labour just continued a lot of Thatcher's policies,
Oh, really?
especially when it came to privatization and deregulation.
So more of the same, just with a different label.
In many ways, yeah.
Okay.
The book uses the gambling industry as like a case study.
Oh, interesting gambling. Okay.
Under New Labour, gambling was increasingly framed as just like a matter of individual choice,
Okay. Yeah.
leading to looser regulations
Okay.
and the spread of those fixed odds betting terminals.
Oh, yeah, the FRBTs. Those were super controversial, weren't they?
Yeah.
I remember hearing stories about people losing like their life savings on those machines.
They were highly addictive, yeah.
Yeah.
And often found in poorer neighborhoods,
Right.
leading to serious financial and social problems.
Wow.
It took years of campaigning to finally get them banned.
It seems like a classic example of how that emphasis on individual choice without like proper regulation can have those unintended negative consequences,
Yeah.
especially for vulnerable populations.
It raises some big questions about the role of government,
Yeah.
in protecting its citizens from predatory industries, even when they're doing it in the name of free markets.
So we've gone from Adam Smith's invisible hand
Yeah.
to the very visible hand of government intervention
Uh-huh.
in the economy.
Right.
Where do things go from there?
Well, the 2008 financial crisis was a major turning point.
2008, yeah.
It seemed to really expose the flaws in those unregulated free markets.
Okay.
And it led to like this temporary resurgence of Keynesian ideas about government intervention.
Right, like massive bank bailouts.
Yes.
It seemed like suddenly the government was willing to spend big to save the economy.
It was a moment of crisis, demanded decisive action.
Right.
But instead of taking that opportunity to fundamentally rethink the economic system
Yeah.
and create a more just and equitable model,
Yeah.
governments doubled down on austerity measures.
Austerity. Isn't that where that whole nation's credit card argument really comes in?
Exactly. The idea was that governments had been living beyond their means
Right.
and needed to like drastically cut spending to reduce debt,
Okay.
regardless of the social costs.
But didn't those austerity measures like end up hurting the most vulnerable people in society
Yeah.
while doing very little to fix the underlying problems?
That's what many economists argue.
Right.
They say those policies often make recessions worse
Okay.
by reducing demand and hindering economic growth.
It seems like the people who actually caused the financial crisis,
Yeah.
the reckless lenders and borrowers, they were often shielded from the worst consequences,
Yeah.
while ordinary people were left to deal with the pain.
It's a valid criticism.
Yeah.
And it points to the need for greater accountability and a fairer way to share the burdens of these economic crises.
Okay, so we've seen how these economic ideas have shaped policies, from Thatcher to Blair and beyond. Where do we go from here? Is there any hope for a more just and sustainable economic system?
Well, Grocott argues that we need to be more critical of the assumptions of mainstream economics,
Okay.
which often prioritizes profit over people and ignores the real-world consequences of its policies.
Right.
He suggests we look at alternative economic models,
Okay.
like the Green New Deal,
Oh, the Green New Deal. Oh,
which aims to address both economic and environmental challenges
okay.
in a more holistic way.
The Green New Deal seems to be gaining a lot of traction.
Yeah.
But it also faces a lot of opposition,
Of course.
especially from those who benefit from the current system. What are the key arguments for and against it?
Well, the Green New Deal proposes this,
Yeah.
massive investment in renewable energy, green jobs, social programs. Essentially, it's like a restructuring of the economy
Wow.
to address climate change and inequality.
Okay.
Its supporters, they argue it's the only way to avoid climate catastrophe
Right.
and create a fairer
Yeah.
and more sustainable future.
Okay, that sounds pretty promising, but what about the criticisms?
Critics often say it's too expensive,
Okay.
unrealistic,
Okay.
and that it'll stifle economic growth.
Yeah.
They also question if it's even possible to transition away from fossil fuels so quickly.
It seems like a real clash of values and priorities. On one hand, you've got those who prioritize short-term economic gains
Yeah.
and the status quo.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are those pushing for a more radical transformation
Right.
to address, long-term sustainability and social justice.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Grocott's main point. Economics. It's not a neutral science.
Right.
It's a field that's shaped by values, ideologies,
Yeah.
power dynamics.
Yeah.
The choices we make, both individually and collectively,
Yeah.
they determine what kind of economic future we create.
This has been a real eye-opener. It's clear that these economic ideas, they're not just theoretical concepts.
No.
They have a direct impact on our lives, and it's up to us to understand them and to choose the path we want to take.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, it's just the beginning.
Okay.
I encourage you to explore these ideas further, dig into the sources,
Yeah.
and start asking yourself, what kind of economy do you want to see?
Yeah.
What values do you want to prioritize? What kind of future do you want to create?
For yourself.
Yeah, and for generations to come.
Wow. We've really gone deep on this one, from that invisible hand to social democracy to neoliberalism.
The Green New Deal.
It's clear that economic ideas have really shaped our world in some pretty big ways.
Sure.
This book really challenged me to think critically about some of those common sense economic ideas that we often just accept without questioning.
Yeah, I think we all do that.
Like that the market always knows best.
Right.
Or that government intervention is always bad.
Yeah, it's easy to just accept those ideas.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to really think about them.
Yeah.
Ask ourselves, who benefits from these ideas?
Right.
And who gets left behind?
One thing that really struck me was that concept of the natural rate of unemployment.
Oh, yeah.
Grocott argues that this idea is often used to justify policies that keep wages low and workers feeling insecure.
It's a really interesting point. The idea of a natural rate suggests that a certain level of unemployment is unavoidable,
Yeah.
even desirable
Okay.
to control inflation.
Right.
But is that really true?
Right.
Or is it just a way to rationalize policies that benefit the people in power?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they're defining natural in a way that just serves their own interests
Right.
rather than the interests of everyday workers.
Exactly.
And it shows how economic ideas can be used to mask power dynamics,
Yeah.
maintain inequality. Another idea that's always presented as common sense is that whole trickle-down economics thing.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that tax cuts for the wealthy will eventually benefit everyone.
Right, right.
Didn't we see that theory kind of debunked during the years of austerity?
I mean, the evidence suggests that trickle-down economics doesn't really work as promised.
Yeah.
Tax cuts for the wealthy often lead to more inequality,
Right.
more concentration of wealth at the top,
Right.
without really boost economic growth or creating more jobs.
So maybe we need to move beyond those kind of simplistic and often harmful economic ideas
I think so.
and start thinking about alternatives that actually prioritize people and the planet.
I think there's so many cool ideas out there.
Yeah.
Like universal basic income,
Cool.
community-owned businesses,
Right.
new forms of democratic economic governance.
Yeah, a lot of possibility.
The key is to be open to those possibilities,
Okay.
to challenge the assumptions of the current system.
I think Grocott's book does a great job of showing that economics isn't destiny.
Yeah,
We have the power to choose a different path,
absolutely.
to create an economy that works for everyone, not just the privileged few.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive has been all about.
Yeah.
Helping you think critically about these ideas.
Yeah.
And imagine a better future.
I feel like I've learned so much.
That's great to hear.
I'm definitely going to look at the world differently now.
I hope so. If this has sparked your curiosity,
It has.
I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Okay.
Read more, talk to people,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid to question the way things are.
It's been a real pleasure diving deep with you into these fascinating ideas.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember,
Yeah.
the future of the economy, it's not set in stone.
Right.
It's up to us to shape it, to create a world that is both prosperous and just.
Well said. On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us. And keep those critical thinking caps on.